Journalism Institute at the University of Missouri. Welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. What happens when a country runs out of money? That's what Greeks have been finding out over the past several years. Earlier this summer, Greece announced it was unable to pay back some of the $270 billion it owes to the International Monetary Fund, eurozone governments, and other creditors. Banks closed, Greeks were limited to withdrawing 60 euros a day from ATMs, and the country was again on the brink of total economic collapse. But this week, Germany and other European governments approved a new bailout for Greece, totaling around $95 billion. This bailout, the country's third since the economic crisis, lets Greece make a $3.6 billion payment to the European Central Bank that was due today. The money does come with strings attached. Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras' government had to reverse itself and agree to new austerity measures. That means sharply higher taxes for many and lower pension payments to retirees. So is this the bailout that solves Greece's economic crisis? What kind of precedent does it set for other countries who are struggling with huge debts? Joining me today from Washington, D.C., Jacob Kirkegaard, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and co-author of Transforming the European Economy. From La Bouge, France, Vicky Pryce. She's the Chief Economic Advisor for the Center for Economic and Business Research, as well as the author of the book, Greekonomics. And from Athens, Yannis Palaiologos, a journalist for Kathimerini, a daily Greek newspaper. Welcome to all of you. Yannis Palaiologos in Athens, tell us just a little bit about what kind of summer this has been in Athens. Those of us watching the news have seen a lot of sort of depressing news about the economic situation there.
Well, it hasn't been much of a summer. The drama of the negotiation and the capital controls, the referendum, all the way up to the deal on July the 13th, took up the first half of it. And now, in mid-August, we're facing the possibility of a fresh election being called. It will be the third time that Greeks have to go to the polls in the space of less than 9 months, if you include the referendum. So, even those of us who are political junkies are a bit exhausted, frankly.
Tell me, if you would, if you took sort of a Sunday stroll through a neighborhood in Athens today, how would that compare with what you saw, what people were thinking and feeling 10 years ago? Like, how are you people noticing this austerity?
Well, 10 years ago was a period of during which Greece was riding high. Probably the highest growth rates in the eurozone. There was ample credit, people were getting richer, and the future seemed very good. And there was no sense of the catastrophe to come. These days, after, this year the economy is returning to recession after having suffered six years of recession. The country has lost more than a quarter of its income. More than 1 in 4 Greeks are unemployed and have been for more than 3 years. So, there's very little enthusiasm, obviously, for the new program. There's a sense that, we've been through it all before and there's no light at the end of the tunnel. I think there is a way out this time around if everyone does what they should, the Greek government and the creditors, especially the European countries. But the way things have worked out before, there's little reason to be optimistic at this point.
And Vicky Pryce, remind our listeners, if you would, briefly, how is it that Greece and its creditors found themselves in this situation? If you could back us up 8 or 9 years, what happened to get us to the point where we are today?
Well, the most important event that took place is, of course, the financial crisis that nobody was prepared for, and least of all the eurozone. Any country in the eurozone was quite incapable of reacting to the crisis by adjusting its economy through devaluation or even expanding its own monetary money supply or changing its monetary policy. So there was no way in which they could react in the way that, for example, either the US or the UK reacted. In addition, there had been problems in Greece already because the government was borrowing quite substantial amounts of money, encouraged by the fact that interest rates at which it could borrow fell very, very significantly when they joined the euro in 2001. And that, of course, encouraged a huge amount of extra public spending. What was discovered in 2009 is that, in fact, the figures that Greece was declaring in terms of its deficit to GDP ratio were considerably higher than the statistics so far had indicated. And Greece found itself unable to borrow in the capital markets from then on and got very little direct support from Europe, and had to go cap in hand and get a bailout, which wasn't even allowed originally in the Maastricht Treaty that set up the euro. So from then on, it had to impose a number of restrictions to get this bailout to be delivered, the money that it had to borrow to be delivered. Unfortunately, after a brief period of some slight sort of improvement, the capital markets reacted even worse, not just for Greece, but also for some of the other countries in the eurozone when they realized the size of the debt that those countries were collecting. And Greece had to go for a second bailout in 2012, by which time its debt was already unsustainable. So it's been downhill ever since. And of course, everything we heard from Yannis in terms of the austerity measures that led to a huge decrease in economic activity followed those two bailouts.
And Jacob Kirkegaard, so we've heard about the first two bailouts. What is the significance of this most recent $95 billion bailout?
Well, I think there's a number of things. First of all, of course, that this is a bailout that is actually overseen by a party or a prime minister, at least, who until very recently were dead against this bailout. So there has been a clear changing of quite a lot of minds in Athens on this. And there is, in my opinion, at least the prospects for better domestic political ownership of this deal. The second major change of this deal is that a key constituent part of it is that the Eurogroup, clearly goaded by the IMF, have made it clear that they will consider granting Greece substantial debt relief later in the year, to the point, I mean, no one quite knows today how much that debt relief will be, but my expectations will certainly be that essentially what will happen is that you take the stock of Greek debt that is owed to the European Stability Mechanism, which is the vast majority of it, and you essentially throw it away in a drawer for about a generation. Meaning that the average maturity of the debt might become 50 years or so, and there would be an interest rate and amortization moratorium of, say, 30 years. And what that means is that we certainly, Greece might still nominally, or in an accounting sense, have a very large debt, 180 or 200% of GDP or whatever the number is. But it doesn't really, in operational terms, matter very much, in my opinion, because the cost of this debt will be extremely low.
And it's been pushed off quite far into the future, so the debt doesn't... Yeah. The immediate payments don't have to be due.
The immediate payments don't have to be made, and what it means is that forward-looking financial markets will actually realize this, and therefore such an arrangement, in my opinion, which will, even in the long run, keep the average cost of debt service in Greece acceptably low, will realize this, and there will be the opportunity, in my opinion, in the next 2 or 3 years for Greece to return to private or affordable private market access, which is, of course, what everyone would like to see.
This is Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. This week, a look at the latest bailout of Greece and how it's going to affect the country for years to come. Our guest this week from Washington, D.C., Jacob Kirkegaard, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and co-author of Transforming the European Economy. From Le Bouge, France, Vicky Pryce. She's the chief economic advisor for the Center for Economic and Business Research, as well as the author of the book Greekonomics. And from Athens, Yannis Palaiologos, a journalist for Kathimerini, a Greek daily newspaper. A reminder that if you're interested in more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues and download past episodes from our archive. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at GlobalJourn. Yannis Palaiologos, Greece's ruling Syriza party came to power in January vowing to reject austerity. There was this referendum again in July where Prime Minister Tsipras gave Greeks the opportunity to weigh in on a third bailout deal with more austerity, and Greeks voted overwhelmingly against austerity. So tell us, if Greeks sort of keep voting against austerity, why do they keep getting it?
Well, I think first of all, Mr. Tsipras rose to power and took his party from 4% to 36% by telling a lot of people what they wanted to hear, irrespective of whether what he was promising was at all realistic. It's clearly a problem in the governance of the eurozone when a country, a people vote for something and then their government is forced to do something else. There's been a lot of discussion during the summer about, it being a coup against Greece and all that. I think most of that is nonsense. But it is true that, when you are unable to borrow from the markets and you are forced to borrow from your European partners, then, they have their own political obligations and own political limitations. And therefore, they are led to offer quite stringent terms for giving you the money. I think the real question here is why we seem to have ended up at the point where we have lower primary surplus targets and the prospect of debt relief for Greece, which is what should have been done already last year, basically, under the previous government. And if not that, then at the beginning of the new government's term back in February, March. And I think, people need to look hard, both within the Syriza government and above all the Prime Minister, who followed a catastrophic strategy for the country which led to the closure of the banks, but also the more hardline elements in Europe led by the Finance Minister of Germany, who ended up undermining Germany's leadership with this very aggressive stance he took in July, the threat of a Grexit, which he has been pushing for 4 years now. So that we ended up where we should have been 6 months or maybe a year ago. So we could have ended up here a long time ago with much less cost for Greece and much less cost also for the creditor countries.
And Jacob Kirkegaard was talking about this sort of sea change in public opinion, or at least in the opinion of the Greek government there. The country does find itself in an interesting situation because it does seem that for the foreseeable future, many of the big decisions about how the country governs itself, how does it fund its schools, how much does it pay its retirees, how much does it tax its citizens, those decisions aren't going to be made by Greeks. And so how do you see that playing out sort of over the longer term?
So is that me or Jacob?
Yeah, sorry, Yannis. That one was for you. I mean, how do you see that situation playing out over the longer term?
Well, I don't think it's politically viable. I mean, having your fiscal policy and your wider economic policy dictated by other countries has obviously, as we've seen in Greece in particular, has raised a lot of hackles, raised a lot of nationalist sentiment and resentment, especially towards Germany. It would have been much better at the beginning of the crisis for the other countries to allow Greece to default on its private creditors. This would have meant that the banks that had bought Greek bonds would have paid the price for their reckless lending. And of course, then the cost of borrowing for Greece would have been much higher, and she would have been forced to be much more prudent in her policies. That is no longer possible, of course, because the vast majority of Greek debt is now in official hands. But it would have avoided all this agony and all this resentment building, which has undermined what the euro was supposed to be about, which was closer European integration. And
Vicky Pryce, Yannis was just talking about this moment earlier this summer when Germany's finance minister sort of voiced something that you hadn't heard from governments previously, which was that he sort of foresaw at least a temporary exit for Greece from the eurozone. How did that change things?
I don't think anybody was in favour of that, and that was clearly a turning point in the sense that the Greeks got slightly scared, but also I think the rest of the Eurogroup members and also the rest of the eurozone overall, including various heads of state, found that to be particularly difficult as a concept, and in reality, it probably would have spelled the beginning of the end of the Eurozone and the Euro project itself. Certainly the Greeks didn't want it, and you can't force a country to move in that direction unless they agree themselves. And it was quite clear that Tsipras and his ministers did not agree to that. And it was quite quickly taken off the negotiating table. And yet, just as Yannis is suggesting, the finance minister carried on referring to this as a possibility. And talking of Grexit of any sort, whether it's short term or longer term, whether it means having a parallel currency, like one of the finance ministers in Greece just before the current one was talking about as well, messing in a way the whole sort of prospects for Greece, frightened the Greeks particularly. And one of the reasons why we've seen such a massive withdrawal of funds from the Greek banking system, which has of course led to them being in serious difficulty right now, is because the Greeks feared this Grexit. All the pronouncements from Germany in particular, and then accentuated by what Finance Minister Schäuble was also saying, have encouraged the Greeks to just take the money out and spend them, actually, which is a good thing, because in a way we wouldn't have had the growth we've seen in the last quarter in Greece, which was very surprising for everyone. If they hadn't done that, they thought perhaps their currency would be useless in the future. They might as well buy whatever they can now. And this is carried on. Right now, when they can't even take the deposits out, they can at least transfer money, and they're buying white goods and cars like there's no tomorrow, fearing that despite the sort of calming words that they've been hearing recently about the banking system, there may still be, in the recapitalization process, which is part of this current deal, a bail-in. In other words, that depositors as well as shareholders may lose some money as part of recapitalizing the banking system. So they're spending it still on buying things, thinking that they might lose this money anyway. They might as well, therefore, just spend it. And so the psychology of the Greeks right now is a slightly schizophrenic one, where, of course, everything looks bad in the future, and yet there they are actually spending their money. And the Germans have certainly not helped in that, in the discussions that have been taking place by basically helping those fears become such that the Greeks are behaving in a way that doesn't make any sense given the current economic circumstances.
And Yannis, this spending spree that Vicky Pryce was just talking about, is that something that you see where people are saying, like, okay, our money isn't safe in our savings accounts anymore. To the extent we can get out of the bank, we're going to go out and buy things. Is that something that you witness?
We've certainly been seeing it and, hearing it in conversation a lot, especially up to the middle of July. And it's been a lot of spending on various goods. It's been paying down debt, paying off taxes, anything to reduce the level of deposits in the deposit account, in the fear above all that these deposits would be turned into drachmas and become worthless. But after that, also in the fear, as Vicky said, that there could be a bail-in of the depositors. Of course, these fears have mostly been calmed now, and they've even been calmed in the case of uninsured depositors who have more than 100,000 euros, because I think the Europeans realized that the damage this would do would be incalculable. But there was a period there of a few weeks where, yes, there was a kind of, last days of Pompeii kind of spending spree.
This is Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. This week we're looking at the Greek economic crisis and the shockwaves it's caused across Europe. Joining me this week from Washington, D.C., Jacob Kirkegaard, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, co-author of Transforming the European Economy. From La Bouche, France, Vicky Pryce. She's the chief economic advisor for the Center for Economic and Business Research, as well as the author of the book Greekonomics. And from Athens, Yannis Palaiologos, a journalist for Kathimerini, a daily Greek newspaper. A reminder that if you're interested in more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues, and download past episodes from our archive. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Global Journ. Jacob Kirkegaard in Washington, remind our listeners why you think it would be a bad idea for Greece to just have left the eurozone. Why was there so much fear around that? Some economists argue that sort of in the short term that would cause Greeks a lot of pain. In the longer term, the country would be better off economically doing that.
Well, I mean, I think leaving aside the broader political ramifications of departing the euro institutions, which in my opinion would entail default against the euro area, and therefore the political reaction against that would probably also lead to Greece leaving the EU. But I think fundamentally, from an economic point of view, the argument that Grexit or the introduction of a new currency in Greece would solve any problem is fundamentally bad economics, because it is often portrayed in the debate as sort of a replica of what happened in Argentina, in some case, when it broke its currency peg in 2001. But there needs to be a very big distinction made between reintroducing a physical currency and breaking a currency peg. These are fundamentally different things, because changing a currency peg you can do overnight. Reintroducing a physical currency you cannot do overnight, and you would have a prolonged period of absolute chaos, of massive capital flight, etc. in Greece, which would be highly destabilizing. Another argument that you sometimes hear economists, especially I would say here in the United States, make is that, well, currencies come and go. We saw it happen with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, or the dissolution of Yugoslavia, or the breakup of Czechoslovakia. You can introduce a new currency. But the reality is that this is also a fundamentally misleading characterization, because we're not talking about the dissolution of the euro here. We're talking about Greece trying to reintroduce its currency, the drachma, while the euro remains fully operational, which means you would have a situation where you would have acute competition between a new drachma and the euro. And I don't think there's any doubt about, while the Greek government would be able to force new drachma on parts of the Greek population, say retirees, public sector workers, it could force businesses to pay taxes in drachma, etc. But the reality is that everyone who had drachma would immediately try to get rid of it, selling it into euros. So the price of the euro, the exchange rate of the drachma, would plummet. We've seen this historically in many Latin American countries of dual currencies, etc. So you'd basically be turning Greece into a sort of a Latin American country of the early 1980s.
Sorry, Yannis Palaiologos, you wanted to add something there.
No, I just wanted to say that Jacob is exactly right. There would be intense competition that the drachma would lose to the euro, because everyone would want to hold euros, and this would lead to prolonged instability. And it's certainly not the case, as some proponents of the drachma have been saying, in Greece and outside it, that it would be a few difficult months and then we'd be on our way to wonderful growth.
No, I think in broader economic terms, what we're talking about here is a lot of academic economists basically saying that Greece would experience what you call a sort of real exchange rate depreciation. Basically, that you would be able to lower the price level in Greece through the introduction of a new currency, have a massive depreciation, and therefore Greece would be able to export itself out of
Greek goods would be
problem.
cheaper, visiting Greece would be cheaper, Greek services would be cheaper, there'd be more economic activity. That's the argument.
That's essentially the argument. But the problem with that argument is that Greece is also a country that imports a great number of essential components: energy, medicine, food, etc., all of which were items that would continue to have to be paid in hard currency, be it dollars or euros, etc., and of course with the price of which in drachma terms would rise dramatically. So you would end up in a situation with very significantly higher levels of inflation in Greece, which of course we know from historical experience that would be devastating for the lowest income segments of the population in Greece. So I certainly believe that many of the economists that advocate this are fundamentally irresponsible in doing so.
Well, let me turn this to Vicky Pryce then. You had written in your book, and you've talked some about how stereotypes within Europe about Greeks and about Greek work habits haven't been very helpful in this crisis, and yet they seem to have had an effect on sort of the discourse. Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Well, that's been a very, very interesting side of the whole debate that's been taking place. The caricatures of Greeks being lazy, and corrupt and avoiding taxes and all that sort of stuff, which, I mean, it's true up to a point, but it's true up to a point in many countries in Europe, and it's not just confined to Greece. What is more, some of the data suggests that quite a lot of the perceptions are just not true. For example, if you look at OECD data, they suggest that the Greeks work longer hours than the Germans. It may not be terribly productive work, but it is certainly longer. Given that there isn't very much investment, probably harder work than the Germans in many ways. And also, of course, in terms of retirement, which is one of the areas that people have been attacking the Greeks on, early retirement benefits in particular. What we see is that the effective retirement age is pretty much on the average of the OECD, so not too dissimilar to many other places. And of course, we've seen huge corruption in other parts of Europe. The countries have gone for bailouts. We've seen it in regions, in Spain, for example. We've seen it in the banking system all across Europe. So Greece is not exceptional from that point of view. What it is exceptional which I think is often forgotten, is that unfortunately, because of the euro and the way it worked, and also mismanagement for years and years, not much has gone into productive investment in Greece to provide an industrial backbone that would allow the country to have something to fall back onto at times of crisis. And because it's been so dependent on imports, just as we heard, the capital controls in particular that we've seen recently have devastated companies, which simply cannot function as a result. But if at least what's been going on right now leads to this rebalancing taking place and bureaucracy being reduced, more companies being allowed to settle in Greece, more investment in even sort of resources and other productive capacity, then perhaps everything that Greece has gone through would be justified in a way, or at least the Greeks could see that there is some light at the end of the tunnel, which is what Yannis was discussing earlier. But of course, these things take time, and in the short term, they need funds. They need a lot of money to be circulating in the economy. They need the banks to work again. They need to have them recapitalized. They need liquidity to be increased in the system, and that's where the focus should be in the short term.
And Jacob Kirkegaard, our time grows short. In 30 seconds, can you just tell us, is this Greece's last bailout? Where do you see the country 5 years from now?
Yeah, I think this is Greece's last bailout, because I think it is a bailout that basically holds the seeds not only for better domestic ownership of the program in Greece, but also has essentially a function that allows for a rolling bailout, so to speak. And that is the debt relief that we have talked about before, which basically through very, very low levels of interest costs to Greece, which will be sustained for decades, is an ongoing sizable fiscal transfer to the country. So I think this is the both last but also best chance for Greece to continue as a prosperous country inside the euro area.
That'll do it for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Many thanks to Jacob Kirkegaard, Vicky Pryce, and Yannis Palaiologos for joining us. Global Journalist executive producer is Josh Kransberg. Our associate producers this week are Javil Ruskaskip and Mikkel Christensen. Our studio director is Travis McMillan from RJI. Our audio engineer is Pat Akers of KVIA. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for joining us.